Pay close attention to this quote by David Rockefeller, and you'll understand what is happening in the world today and where the American people are heading as a nation. We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subjected to the lights of publicity during those years. But now, the world is more sophisticated and prepared to march towards a world government. The supranational sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national autodetermination practiced in past centuries. David Rockefeller, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations,
Hi, I'm Pastor Joe Green, head pastor of Antioch Assembly in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I'm also the founder of the 2019 movement, and I want to share a couple of thoughts with you today. And today I want to talk about the real controlling powers behind the United States government and the affairs of the world. Who is the real power behind the affairs that we see? In 2008, when the U.S. economy basically crashed, I began to do an in-depth study about some of the things that I was hearing and seeing in regards to the U.S. economy and the U.S. government. I started to hear things about derivatives and debt, mortgage-backed securities, and things of that nature. What I found was quite interesting. And let me tell you a little bit about myself. Aside from being a pastor and a student of the Bible, I've owned my own business. I actually had a media company where at one point I owned 3 celestial radio stations, or had the rights to them, operated 2, and the other one I had the license to it. I worked as a financial advisor for Merrill Lynch and for Morgan Stanley for a while, and now I currently am licensed. I had a securities license, Series 7 license. I have been trained in selling annuities and other financial products as far as various types of insurance. And so I understand a little bit about the financial markets. I'm not an expert. I'm not a, but I know enough to know when things weren't going wrong. So as I began to, when things weren't going as they had appeared to be. And so what I began to really study and look at these things in depth, what I found was quite shocking. And I don't share my credentials for you to put me on a pedestal or to brag about these things, but just so you know that I have some intellectual basis and knowledge from where I'm coming from. And what I'm about to tell you, what I'm about to talk about, I've been talking about for several years. I'm just going to put it in a little bit of a different perspective. And a lot of people, I did a video talking about how could a black pastor support President Trump, Donald Trump. And as I stated and I restate, it's not so much that I'm a pro-Trump or I'm a fan of President Trump, but I'm anti-globalist. And as a pastor, as a Christian, especially as a person of color, I think that with the information that I've obtained, it would only make sense for me to be anti-globalist. And so within the constructs or the confines of the globalism or the international banking cartel, the Rothschild banking cartel, whatever you want to call them, we have a group that are Luciferians. They call the Illuminati, and they believe that Lucifer was the light bearer or the light bringer, and that he gives them secret knowledge. And so at the top of the food chain with the Illuminati and the Masonic organizations and these other organizations, you find Lucifer, which the Bible refers to as the fallen angel or the devil or Satan. And so as a pastor, as a Christian, as someone who reads the Bible, and especially as a person of color, it only makes sense for us to be in opposition to the Illuminati or the globalists, those who are trying to develop a new world order. So one of the tools, and one of the most effective and powerful tools that they use, is the banking system. The Bible says that the love of money is the root of all evil. And so when you start to look at the major atrocities throughout history and throughout the world, you can usually tie them back to money, to greed. And behind most of the major atrocities in the world, you'll find the international bankers. As a passionate and avid student of history, I've realized that the Federal Reserve and the people behind the international banks, the global banking cartel or cabal, however you want to define them, has been really plaguing humanity for a long time, especially black people. See, the transatlantic slave trade was not about black or white, it was about economics. It was about money. And if you look behind the scenes of the transatlantic slave trade, you find the international bankers, the Rothschild banking cartel. When you understand about eugenics, when you understand about most of the wars that have been fought, major wars that have been fought since the time of Napoleon, the international bankers have financed at least one or both sides of every war since Napoleon, every major war. They were involved in the Civil War during the time of Lincoln, and Lincoln gave some very open remarks against the international bankers and how they wanted to influence the United States affairs of the government. Now, before you jump to conclusions, I want you to have open ears and an open mind as to what I'm about to say to you. One of the things that we'll find if you do the research is that currently there's only about 3 or 4 major countries in the world that don't have a Rothschild-controlled central bank. Only about 3 or 4 countries in the world. And when I say 3 or 4, Russia had a central bank, a Rothschild-controlled central bank, but recently it's been reported that Vladimir Putin kicked them out of Russia, which makes sense as to why there's an all-out assault on Russia right now. You know, for several years, Russia and the United States started to develop an amicable relationship, but now they are enemy number one. And you'll see the pattern that whenever someone rejects the international banking cabal or kicks them out of their country, they become a target for these international bankers. So in the year 2000, there were 7 countries without a Rothschild-owned or controlled central bank. Those 7 countries were Afghanistan, Iraq, Sudan, Libya, Cuba, North Korea, and Iran. And again, you can research these for yourselves, that this is all public record. And in 2003, the only countries left without a central bank controlled by the Rothschilds International Bank was Sudan, Libya, Cuba, North Korea, and Iran. And the interesting thing about it is, I go forward, anybody who's been paying attention to the news, you will see it's not a coincidence that these are the countries that don't have a Rothschild controlled central bank. In 2011, there were 3, and the 3 countries in 2011 were Cuba, North Korea, and Iran. So Cuba, North Korea, and Iran are 3 countries that do not have a Rothschild-controlled central bank. And there's a book out by John Coleman, I think his name is, and it's called Confessions of an International Hitman. And basically what he does is he worked for the CIA, and he talked about how the international bankers would target these leaders. They would go in and they would finance or give them a lot of money for their country, put them in debt, and then when they didn't comply to the agenda driven by the international bankers, they would be targeted for assassination, or the armies would go in and go to war with them. And so, like I mentioned to you, if you notice, Afghanistan, Iraq, Sudan are on the list for not having international banks. Now Cuba, North Korea, and Iran, and coincidentally enough, those are the targets. Those are some of the targets right now that the media and the United States government has targeted for having some type of military conflict or some kind of issue with. So I say all that to give you a background about where we're at right now, and to tell you a little bit about what happened and how they came. You know, the Federal Reserve is the central bank here in the United States, and I want you to understand that the Federal Reserve is not a governmental entity. It's a privately owned bank with stockholders that actually controls the economy of the United States government. And how does it do that? when in 2008, when they continued to talk about the debt that the United States owed, I think it was either 2010 or 2011, they said that we were going to default on our debt, which meant that our credit rating was going to go down. I began to really research to figure out who is it that we could owe money to. The United States of America is the largest economy in the world, so who could we owe money to, and how is it that our credit rating is going to go down? So when you do further research, you'll find out that we owe the Federal Reserve money. That actually it's the Federal Reserve that lends money to the United States government that we have to pay back with interest. And so that's when they keep talking about our debt, and how the controversy came up is when President Obama was president, he wanted to raise the debt ceiling, and the Republicans in Congress fought against that because they didn't want to raise the debt ceiling. It's very clear, and the Bible says that the debtor is subservient to the lender, which means that when you owe debt, especially a large amount of debt, you are in a certain aspect, you are indebted to them, you are in bondage to them. And so when our government continues to build up this large amount of debt to the Federal Reserve, it just means that we are more and more under their authority, or under their care. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. But in a nutshell, how it happened is, the Rothschild banking cartel goes back several centuries. The Bank of London, there were actually 5 main cities in Europe that were a part of the Rothschild banking cartel. One of the major ones that we can be concerned with is the Bank of London. The Bank of London is under the Rothschild International Banking Cartel. The Bank of London actually controls our Federal Reserve. And so when you understand the prime rate, when you hear things like the prime rate, if you go to borrow a house or take out a loan and you start to talk about the prime lending rate, that is actually determined by the Federal Reserve. And so what the prime lending rate is when the Federal Reserve loans money to the United States government, they determine the interest rate on the payback of the loan. So when our economy is going too fast or growing too fast, which is called inflation, then the Federal Reserve jacks up interest rates to make it more expensive to borrow money. And so when it's more expensive to borrow money, then that means people borrow less. When our economy is beginning to slow, like when we go into a recession, then the Federal Reserve lowers their interest rate. It means they lower the amount that they are charging the United States government to borrow money. They actually loan money to our banks, and our banks re-lend the money out to individuals and to businesses. So the Federal Reserve lower the interest rate that they're charging the banks, and we go to our regular bank and we take out loans, and the Federal Reserve is the one that determines the interest rate, which is why several years ago when we refinanced our house, the interest rate, the prime rate, was very low because our economy had been in recession for some time. So in order for them to try to speed up the economy, they lowered the interest rate to make it more appealing for people to go out and borrow money. But anyway, that's a side note for you to understand. When you start hearing about the prime rate, when you hear about LIBOR is the Bank of London's interest rate, which LIBOR actually is over and it affects our Federal Reserve Bank. So here's an interesting fact. They call them the 4 horsemen of banking, which is Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo. They own the major oil companies, which is ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell, BP, Chevron, and Texaco. And they're in tandem with Deutsche Bank, BNP, Barclays, and other European old money banks. But the monopoly over the global economy does not end in the oil industry. According to the 10K filings, which 10K filings are filings that major corporations have to file to our Securities and Exchange Commission, the 4 horsemen of the banking are among the top 10 stockholders of virtually every Fortune 500 corporation. And you can find these out. These things are public record. And it says here, this is the person writing the article, my queries to bank regulatory agencies regarding stock ownership in the top 25 U.S. bank holding companies were given Freedom of Information Act Act, which is each and every one of you can do that. These are federal documents that when you file, they are obligated to make them declassified, and you can get this information if you look for it. Freedom of Information Act. Before they'll try to keep it a secret, but you have access to these. So one important repository of wealth of the global banking system that owns these banks is the U.S. Trust Corporation, which was founded in 1853 and now owned by Bank of America. Recent U.S. Trust Corporate Director and Honorary Trustee was Walter Rothschild, and you recognize the name Rothschild. Other directors include Daniel Davidson of J.P. Morgan Chase, Richard Tucker of ExxonMobil, Daniel Roberts of Citigroup, and Marshall Schwartz of Morgan Stanley. 80% of the world's banking is owned by these people. J.W. McAllister, an oil industry insider with the House of Saud, wrote, it's a book called The Grim Reaper, that information he acquired from Saudi bankers cited 80% ownership of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, by far the most powerful Fed branch. And so the Federal Reserve Bank in New York is what we're referring to. And it's owned by 8 families. The 80% of the ownership of the Federal Reserve of New York is owned by 8 families. So we're talking about the largest banks in the world. And so when you think about Wells Fargo and J.P. Morgan Chase and Citigroup, they actually borrow money from the Federal Reserve in order to loan you and me money. And the Federal Reserve of New York is owned by 8 families, and they are the Goldman Sachs, Rockefellers, Lehman's, Kuhn Liebs of New York, the Rothschilds of Paris and the Rothschilds of London, the Warburgs of Hamburg, Germany, the Lazards of Paris, and the Israel Moses Seifs of Rome. And so these people own 80% of the Federal Reserve. It's, like I said, it's a private corporation. And again, one of the references that during the 2016 campaign schedule, I heard Donald Trump call for an audit of the reserve. Ron Paul has been talking about that for a long time. If you ever follow Ron Paul, he always talks about the Federal Reserve and how we should audit it. It's a private corporation that lends money to the United States government, which gives it control over our economy. And you have to realize that, when the Federal Reserve, if they have that much power over our economy, they're not elected by anybody. The United States public does not have any input into the Federal Reserve, and they're not supposed to be able to print money. Our Constitution stated originally that it is only Congress that has the ability to print money, which is why many of the presidents had gotten into trouble. Abraham Lincoln had created his own money, which were called greenbacks, that he wouldn't take the Federal Reserve notes that the Federal Reserve was issuing out, had his own money, so he was targeted. JFK signed Executive Order 1110, and that was to take the power of the ability to print money from the Federal Reserve and give it back to the United States Congress, because you understand from an accountability perspective, we vote in our Congress people. And so if we vote in our Congress people and they have the ability to print money, then we would have a say-so over how the money is used and distributed. But because they don't have the ability to print money, we borrow money from the Federal Reserve, then they have no accountability to the American public, and the average person hasn't even heard of them. Now, this is just to take it a step further so you understand that our dollars, if you notice, and this is a $5 bill, and if you look on the you can look on a $1 bill or a $10 bill. At the top of it, it says a Federal Reserve note. This is a Federal Reserve note. So our money comes from the Federal Reserve. So we make U.S. Treasury bonds. We sell them to the Federal Reserve. In return, or we give them to the Federal Reserve or sell them however you want. In return, the Federal Reserve prints money and loans it back to us. Now I'm going to give you a brief history. I wanted to give you some background, and I hope that didn't, some people may understand what I'm saying. Some people, I hope it's not anything new, that I'm not going too fast. I want you to understand this. So what happened was, traditionally, from the time of the Civil War, the international bankers, or from the formation of the country. Now, the Federal Reserve, or the Rothschild banking cartel, is a part of the Illuminati. So I want you to understand that part of it. They're not separate. They are the financial and the economic arm of the Illuminati. And so soon after the foundation of the country, they wanted to bring in a centralized Federal Reserve Bank here in the United States. It met with resistance several times. Abraham Lincoln resisted the Federal Reserve banks from coming in, the central banks. They wanted to loan him money for the Civil War. He refused it because the interest was so high. So at that point, because one of the Federal Reserve banks is in France, they were going to get France to come in and to fight along with the South against the North, because one of the primary issues during the Civil War was the central banks, the Federal Reserve banks. The different states didn't want to have a federal bank to come in, which is why many people fought for states' rights, because they wanted the ability for each state to determine it and not have a federal bank that controlled most of the other banks. In the South, you had the international bankers that were very prevalent there, because the transatlantic slave trade was primarily financed by the international bankers. So now you have the South that is okay with it because they have a lot of influence in the South, whereas the North didn't want them to come, and the North didn't prosper. Their economy wasn't prospering from free labor like the South, and so there was a big conflict. Again, slavery was based on money and economics. It wasn't based on racism. Racism was a subtext, if you will, because the first slaves that came over were indentured servants, and they were primarily European people. As a matter of fact, the word slave itself, as we know it, is a word that comes from Slavic, the Slavic language, because there were European, Eastern Europeans and Western Europeans that were one of the primary commodities of the transatlantic slave trade initially, and they were all indentured servants. After a certain amount of years, you were able to get freedom. So the word slave comes from the Slavic language, because slave primarily were people from that area of the world. So anyway, during that time, you have Lincoln that rejects the central banks, and once he rejects the central banks, they were going to get France to come in and fight on behalf of the South, and France had a very powerful army, and the central banks had a lot of influence in France because that was one of the places that the central banks, the Rothschild family, hailed from. Now, when that happened, you had Russia, and you had the czars in Russia, because it was a monarchy, that threatened the international banks. They were always an enemy of the international banks, that if the international banks got France to get involved, then Russia was going to come and fight on behalf of the North. And because of that, France backed down. We had the Civil War. The North won. And of course, in 1865, you have the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, fast forward a little bit later, in 1913 in the United States, you have on Jekyll Island, off the coast of Georgia, at nighttime, they passed the Federal Reserve Act under the radar. They passed it through, which brought the central banks to the United States. That was in 1913, and they had a 20-year window in which they were going to implement the full, coming in of the central banks. Now, after 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was signed in the United States. It gave the power of the Federal Reserve to come into the United States. And then an interesting thing happened in 1917. You had the Bolshevik Revolution, where you had a communist overthrow in Russia. And when you understand the nature of communism, the communists actually were a governmental arm of the Illuminati. And so, as a payback for them getting involved in the Civil War that helped to keep the central banks from coming to the United States in the 1860s, they overthrew and they implemented communism in Russia. Now, that was in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution. 1913, you had the Federal Reserve Act. They had a 20-year window to come in, and then coincidentally enough, in 1929, you had the stock market crash. And when you understand the fiat currency system and some of the other things, it's easy to manipulate stock markets and financial markets if you know what you're doing. They had the stock market crash in 1929. The United States government filed bankruptcy. And so whenever you file bankruptcy, you have to have an executor to the bankruptcy. And so because the United States government filed bankruptcy, then you had the Federal Reserve come in, and in 1933 actually took over the economy as the executor to the United States government. Then you had the Social Security Act, because in order for you to have a bankruptcy and an executor, you have to have a promise to pay. And so they started the Social Security Administration. You have certificates of live births, which is the same as a stock certificate. If you look on the bottom of your birth certificate, there's a number, a certificate number. Your Social Security number is a promise to pay to the Federal Reserve. And so many people find that hard to believe, but check it out for yourself. Your birth certificate is actually a financial instrument because it's a certificate just like a stock certificate. So before that, 1933 or the 1930s, before you had the Social Security Administration forming, most people had some other record. So you either had the family Bible. When my Nana and Pop-Up had to file for their benefits, they didn't have birth certificates. They had the family Bible where all these things were recorded, maybe in the courthouse or different things like that where they recorded these things, but you didn't have the Social Security Administration. And so you have these things happening. You have now the Federal Reserve takes over the economy of the United States because they're the ones who are printing the money, loaning it to the United States government. And so because it's based on a fiat money currency system, which Richard Nixon, I believe it was, took us off the gold standard, which means our money has no value, no inherent value. This is all paper money, and they determine the value of the money, which means the more money that they print, the less the dollar is valued. Another thing, when we talk about the oil industry, most people don't realize that the international oil trade is based on US dollars, which means no matter what country in the world that you trade oil, it is traded on US dollars, which makes gives some type of stability to the United States dollar, keeps it having value because all the nations of the world that trade oil actually use US dollars. Now think about this for a second. If you print a whole bunch of money, it devalues the dollar, right? Now you also have the oil industry that's involved in this. So if any of you may have heard or seen, there was a leader in Libya by the name of Muammar Gaddafi who continued to try to get the oil nations, the OPEC nations, to have their own monetary system and to refuse to trade on US dollars. And because of that, of course, he was targeted because, like I told you, back in 2000 and in 2003, Libya was one of the countries that didn't have central banks there. But now, in 2017, you can find a central bank in Libya. What a surprise. So I want you to understand that these things are not a coincidence, that these are not things that happen by happenstance, that they are all very well orchestrated. And so I want you to study these things when you get a chance. Look it up for yourself. Like I said, a lot of people question why I support Donald Trump, because when I heard his rhetoric, and of course, you know, many people will say, well, he's a politician. He may just say whatever he wants to say. And that could be the case as well. But nobody else is even saying these things. No other politician even acts like this is real. You know, most of them have tried to hide these things, and even though it's written in books, it's documented. You can go look it up for yourself. But the mainstream media and the public as a whole do not talk about these things, which is why I believe that this is a time, just like with the 2019 movement, that God is bringing these things to the surface so that we, the people, can be empowered once again and not be under the thumb of an entity that is controlled by Lucifer, basically. So this has been Pastor Joe Green, and I don't want to give you too much information, but I want you to take the time when you get a chance to research the things that I'm telling you. Understand who is in control of our economy. It is the globalists. It is foreign entities and foreign powers that actually control our economy. And just like Nathan Rothschild said, he says he doesn't care who writes the laws. If he can control the money, he can control the government. Until next time, be blessed. This has been Pastor Joe Green, 2019 movement founder, pastor of Antioch Assembly. I love you and be blessed. Talk to you soon.
Let's say the United States needs money. Instead of issuing their own United States notes backed by their own credit, they issue treasury bonds. They then sell these bonds to the Federal Reserve, which buys them with money they created out of thin air. The money that the Fed created then goes to the U.S. The U.S. then pays interest on the money that the Fed lent to the Treasury. So to clarify, the Fed creates money from nothing, loans that money to the U.S., and then charges interest on that money. What this means is that there is never and will never be enough money in circulation or in existence to pay back that debt. We as a country, as well as private citizens, are forever enslaved by debt with no way of ever paying it off. Now, when the Federal Reserve buys bonds on Wall Street, the major financial firms that have been selected as dealers deposit the proceeds at their own banks. Fed rules require banks to keep 10% of their deposits in reserves, but the bank is free to issue loans equal to the remaining 90%. Let's say the Federal Reserve buys a $1,000 bond. After putting away 10% into their reserves, they are then able to loan out 90%, or $900. Since the original $1,000 is still on deposit, the $900 in loan proceeds is more new money, money created out of nothing. A total of $1,900 of new money is now available in the economy. Now the person that took the $900 loan spends that money. The payee then deposits the $900 into their bank account, and once again, reserves and deposits increase. This process goes on until that original $1,000 bond, which was created from nothing, becomes $10,000, making this one full-fledged debt machine while also devaluing the dollar. The more money that is out in the economy, the more the value decreases. There's no wonder that since the implementation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, the dollar has lost over 95% of its value. The US dollar will eventually be destroyed due to an overwhelming financial crisis, and a globalist-run monetary authority will come along to save the day. And much like the Fed pretends that its goal is to prevent another Great Depression, the global currency will pledge to prevent another financial crisis, thus putting more power into the hands of a few and enslaving humanity that much more.
The attacks on the Federal Reserve and its chair, Janet Yellen, have been unprecedented, coming from a Republican presidential nominee, and they have stunned Washington insiders.
I believe the Fed is very political. It's become very political.
Donald Trump has opened up a new front in his war against the establishment by accusing Ms. Yellen of being in a conspiracy with Barack Obama to keep rates low and of juicing the stock market. Last week, Scott Garrett, a Republican congressman from New Jersey, added his voice to the criticism.
The Fed has an unacceptable, cozy relationship both with the Obama administration and with higher-ups in the Democratic Party. There have been published media reports talking about that, so you're not familiar with those media reports.
What's important to me is whether or not in our decision-making, our collective decision-making, I see politics being brought to bear in reasoning about our decisions, and I have never seen that on the part of any of my colleagues.
Mr. Trump's attacks are just the latest populist challenge to central banks around the world as public confidence in technocratic elites wanes and policymakers struggle to meet expectations for what
Recently, the Trump campaign has come out and attacked the Federal Reserve's politically motivated manipulation of interest rates. Trump came out and he blasted the very false economy, the manipulated stock market, and of course the chairperson of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen, who has been keeping interest rates way below where the market would have them, presumably, at least in Trump's view and in the view of many other analysts, in an effort to prop up the Obama economy, prop up the stock market, and keep things running smoothly until at least after the election. There's a number of facets that I want to analyze here, but I want to start by saying that I think regardless of what you think of Trump or his campaign, he has performed a tremendous service to the American people and to the world by highlighting these key issues. Now these are issues that Clinton came out and said, no, we should never talk about the Federal Reserve. You should not comment on what the Federal Reserve is doing. And frankly, I find that disgusting. The Federal Reserve is maybe one of the most powerful agencies of the U.S. government, assuming you count it as part of the U.S. government. Technically, it's not. But it is one of the most powerful institutions in this country. The idea that a presidential candidate has no right to talk about it is absurd. And Trump has done a huge favor to us all by breaking the silence on this important issue.